welcome everyone to the December 22 Martin Gardner Celebration of Mind Talk. I'm your host, Bob Hearn. I'm the Gathering for Gardner Program Chair. Our speaker today is from Greenwich. And so we are very pleased to have Tony Mann, who teaches at the University of Greenwich and has also recently co-edited the book, Mathematics at the Meridian, the History of Mathematics at Greenwich. He's going to be speaking to us about John Buridan's self-referential paradoxes. If you're like me, the name Buridan, in relation to you might know in relation to Buridan's ass, the hypothetical donkey that starved to death because it couldn't decide between two equally distant bales of hay. I was not familiar with his anything beyond that, and so I'm very curious and excited to hear more about his self-referential paradoxes. Tony, please take it away.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to talk about John Buridan. I'm going to say a little bit about who John Buridan was. I'll then talk about Buridan's ass. I will give some stories about Buridan's life, which I think are interesting, albeit almost certainly not true. I'll say briefly a little bit about Buridan's work on Impetus, and I'll give an example of his analysis of trade. The bulk of the talk will look at some of his self-referential paradoxes, and after we conclude, I'm going to give you a final puzzle to solve, which I hope is in the spirit of Buridan's work. I first came across John Buridan through the painter Patrick Hughes. Patrick Hughes is an artist. He's famous particularly for perspective works. Behind me on my wall, you can see this is not one of his. This is by Guy Sumpter, but I believe Patrick Hughes has given his approval for it. But these are works which play games with the brain and lead to all sorts of strange feelings when you look at them. It doesn't work looking at a picture of it in the same way. So looking at the one on my wall isn't going to work for you. But if you ever get the chance to see one, I do recommend you take the opportunity. There's a particularly good one in the British Library where you can actually watch people reacting to it, which is always fun. Anyway, when I was a student, I got a book by Patrick Hughes and George Brecht called Vicious Circles and Infinity, which is a collection of paradoxes. And I can't remember if I got it because I was interested in paradoxes or if I'm interested in paradoxes because of the book, but that certainly has fascinated me for many years. And Patrick Hughes has more recently published an enlarged version called Paradoxymoron, which I strongly recommend. It's available from his website, and I'll be quoting from it, or I'll be referring to it a couple of times. And in this book, there's a book list at the end, and one of the books that he recommended was a book of John Buridan's self-referential paradoxes. And I got this book and I was astonished because these seem to me paradoxes that I should have known about long before. And I don't think I did. Now, I caveat that because my memory is terrible these days, and I may well have seen them and not remembered them, but I'm not sure I did. So I feel that these things should be shared. People should know more about John Buridan and his self-referential paradoxes. And I should also begin with a big caveat. I'm not an expert on medieval logic. My interest is not that of a historian here. My interest is in how these paradoxes seem to me today. So I hope that's okay for this talk, but this is not a historical presentation. So who was John Buridan? Well, he was born around 1300 in Picardy, so he lived in the first half of the 14th century. He taught at the University of Paris. He wasn't a member of a religious order, which restricted him. He wasn't allowed to write about theology, for example. We know he was alive in 1359 when he was called upon to adjudicate a dispute. There's a record of that. And we think he died in or just before 1362, when one of his benefices was passed on to somebody else. And I don't think we know a great deal more about him than that. although I will mention a couple of stories in a moment. But he's remembered for Buridan's ass, the donkey which, as Bob said earlier, is hungry. There are two equally attractive bales of hay, equidistant. Which one should it eat first? There's no reason for choosing one rather than the other, so it dies because it's unable to choose which one to eat. It doesn't eat at all, and it dies of starvation. And this story is a gift for cartoonists. Here we see a couple of examples. This one is from France in 1859, with a donkey unable to choose between peace and war. This is 1870, presumably a reference to the Franco-Prussian War, a donkey unable to choose between Paris and Berlin. And United States, 1900, the Senate and the Congress unable to choose between Panama and Nicaragua as the route for the canal to join the Atlantic and the Pacific. So it's always, it's a nice example for cartoonists, politicians, whatever. One question is, what does it have to do with John Buridan? It doesn't actually appear anywhere in Buridan's writings. It dates long before him. There are very similar examples in Aristotle, for example, hundreds of years before. Another example is a donkey which is thirsty and hungry and cannot decide whether to eat or drink first, and therefore starves and dies of thirst. And that's, I think, possibly an older example than the bales of hay, but very similar. So it doesn't appear in Buridan's writings. There's a suggestion that this may have been a parody, that Buridan's philosophical opponents may have used this example to parody an example in Buridan's Ethics, when he suggests that one should choose the best action, and if two actions appear equally good, then one has to gather more information before one can decide what to do. And so it seems that possibly the Buridan's ass example was created to parody Buridan's ideas in ethics. And if so, it seems a little bit sad to me that Buridan's name is now associated with something which essentially was used by his opponents to mock him. But anyway, that's Buridan's ass, and that's all certainly that I knew about Buridan before I found this book that I mentioned earlier. But it turns out Buridan, at least in legend, had quite an eventful life. I'm going to give you two stories. The first concerns an episode when he and a certain Pierre were rivals for the affections of the wife of a shoemaker. And it appears that Buridan struck Roger over the head with a boot. This didn't, in fact, damage Roger. What it did do was give him a phenomenal memory. And so when Roger, a few years later, became Pope Clement VI, he was famous for his memory. And this was all due to being hit on the head by Buridan when they were competitors for in an amorous matter. And although it's a lovely story, I don't think there's any reason to believe it is true. The second example is the story that Buridan was thrown into the Seine in a sack, either by the King of France or possibly by the Queen, but this is all to do with Buridan's supposed relationship with the Queen of France. In the stories, it's not always clear whether he drowned as a result, or whether, in some versions, he was saved by his students at the University of Paris, who loved him as a teacher. But this story does in fact get into one of the great French poems of the time, or a bit later, François Villon's Ballad des Dames du Temps Jadis of 1461, 100 years after Buridan died. This is the poem which contains the repeated line, Où sont les neiges d'antan, or where are the snows of yesteryear? I'm not going to read any more in my appalling French, but luckily this was translated by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who incidentally was a friend of my great-grandfather's. Here's Rossetti in a photograph by Lewis Carroll, and Rossetti's sensation, as you can see, says, "Where, I pray you, is the queen who willed that Buridan should steer, sewed in a sack's mouth down the Seine? But where are the snows of yesteryear?" And just as an aside, another book I loved when I was a student was The Best of Miles, writings by the Irish humorist Miles Nagopoline, or Flann O'Brien, real name Brian O'Nolan. And Miles suggested that in winter, when it snows, you should gather the snow and save some of it in a biscuit tin. Why would you do this? Because at some point in the future, you'll almost certainly have a house guest who is a soulful young man who will wander around quoting poetry. And at some point, he's going to say, "Where are the snows of yesteryear?" At which point, you bring out your biscuit tin and say, "Here they are, here they are." And again, that's the kind of story that appeals to me, but has nothing to do with John Buridan. So let's move on to what Buridan actually did. And just as one example of his mathematical work, he wrote mechanics. So Aristotle believed that things move because a force keeps them moving. And so planets move because God is moving them all the time. But this presents a problem because God does not work on Sundays. So why do planets keep moving on Sundays if it requires a force to move them? So Buridan came up with a theory of impetus, which we might, I think, now call inertia. Essentially, his analysis was very similar to Newton's first law, Newton, of course, coming 350 years later. But I'm not an applied mathematician, so I don't want to say anything more about that. But it's just significant that Buridan did important early work on mechanics. He also wrote about money and trade, and I can't resist sharing this example of one of his examples about trade. So one view of trade is that it's a two-player game in which one player wins and the other player loses. So if I do a deal with you, if I come out of it well, you come out of it badly. My gain is your loss, or vice versa. And Buridan argued that this is not the case. And the example he used is quite interesting. He suggests that, so he has two characters who he calls Socrates and Plato. And these are just names. They're not meant to be the ancient Greek philosophers, I don't think. So Buridan suggests that if Socrates gives his wife willingly and with her consent to Plato to commit adultery in exchange for 10 books, which of them gained and which lost? And I have to say I'm very pleased that he does note that the wife gives her consent for this, because otherwise it would be a pretty unpleasant, sordid exchange. But assuming that everybody's happy with it, who has suffered a loss, who has gained? Because both Socrates and Plato have gained more than they've lost. They've done the deal because Socrates wants the books and Plato wants to commit adultery. So, although he notes that both may have suffered injury as far as their soul is concerned, apart from that, both have gained more than they've lost. And so this is showing that trade is a non-zero sum game. And this is, 600 years before von Neumann and Morgenstern wrote their book about game theory. It's even 450 years before Jane Austen wrote her novels, which apparently also explore game theory, according to a recent book. But again, this seems to be an extraordinary example for a 14th century cleric to use. I mean, the idea of trade as a mutual benefit is, doesn't need an example like this. You could have much less controversial examples, I feel, than that. So it was an interesting choice. So Buridan is somebody who I think chooses interesting examples, and clearly his life was interesting enough that, and he was famous enough, that these curious stories about him circulated. Anyway, let's move on to the self-reference, which is what I said I would talk about. So this is a book and I'm taking my translations from the book by G.E. Hughes, of 20 sophisms, 20 propositions which are paradoxical, and in each case, Buridan gives arguments in favor, arguments why the proposition is true, and also arguments why the proposition is false. And because they're paradoxes, there are arguments on both sides. I'm not going to, in general, go much into his arguments. I think the paradoxes sort of stand for themselves. And some, I think, seem to me very modern, and some less so. The first paradox is the statement, every proposition is affirmative, therefore no proposition is negative. And the assumption here is that God has annihilated all negative propositions. So if that is the case, then it's certainly true that every proposition is affirmative, but that statement implies no proposition is negative, which is, of course, a negative proposition, and therefore cannot exist. So that's the first paradox, which I'm not in general going to spend too much time on these paradoxes. I will leave you to think about them, but that's the first one. Fourth one, suppose I say that a man is a donkey. Now, a man is a donkey is a statement which is false, and Buridan uses it as his canonical false proposition. So I say that a man is a donkey. Is that true or false? It's true, because I just said it. I say it, and I've said it. It doesn't, so the statement is true, but that, of course, doesn't actually imply that a man is a donkey. And Buridan's analysis includes noting that in the Bible, the words appear, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. So the Bible contains the words, there is no God, but that does not make it true. And I find this one slightly strange, because I can't quite understand why this is worth commenting on. It seems to me obvious that somebody can say something is false. But it perhaps reminds me a little bit of Curry's paradox, which says, this is a modern paradox, it says, if a statement is true, then I am king. Is a statement true or false? Well, the only way it can be true and it can be false is if the first part is true and the second part is false. But if the first part is true, then the whole statement is true. So that can't be the case. So this whole statement must be true. And if it's true, then it appears, although I didn't know this, that I'm actually king. And I guess that's a little bit similar to the Buridan's paradox that I've just mentioned. The fifth one, there are 20, I'm only choosing a few. This one says, whatever Socrates is saying, Plato is hearing. But the particular case is that Socrates has said, no men are donkeys, which is true, but Plato doesn't hear the word no and thinks Socrates has said, men are donkeys. So Plato has heard what Socrates has said, it would seem, so the sophism is true. Plato has heard Socrates, but Plato has heard Socrates say something which is false, whereas Socrates actually said something which is true. So that's the apparent paradox. Okay, let's go on to the seventh proposition. This one, a bit similar to the first one, posits that all true propositions have been annihilated. So the only propositions that exist are false. So every proposition is false, but that is a proposition which in that case is true. So, but if it's true, then it can't be true. If it's true, then every proposition is false, so it must itself be false. But if it's false, it can be true. So you end up in one of these endless loops, which we'll come across in some more examples. Number 8, Socrates says, what Plato says is false, and Plato says, what Socrates says is false. Is Socrates' statement true? Well, if it's true, then what Plato says is false, and that would mean that Socrates is telling the truth, which is fine, he is. But if Socrates' statement is false, then is again consistent. If Socrates' statement is false, then Plato's statement is also false, and therefore Socrates' statement is true. If I got this right. I find this one confusing, so perhaps I'll just pass on, but that's the paradox. 10th one, this one assumes we have a set of propositions, of which in fact there are 4, and the first proposition is there are the same number of true and false propositions in this set. The other 3 propositions are God exists, which is true for Buridan, a man is an animal, which is true, and a horse is a goat, which is false. So there are, with proposition 1, there are 2 true propositions and 1 false propositions. So is the first proposition true? If so, then there are 3 true propositions and 1 false one, in which case the first proposition is false. So it can't be true. But if it's false, then there are 2 false propositions and 2 true propositions, and therefore it is true. So again, we have this infinite loop in which propositions are simultaneously true or false, or cannot be true without being simultaneously false. And this one reminds me of a paradox I came across in Martin Gardner in my youth, which I loved. Consider the 2 statements. First statement says both these statements are false, and the second sentence says I am king. Now, the first sentence cannot be true, because if the first sentence is true, then it implies it is false. The first statement must be false. If the second statement is also false, then the first statement will be true. So that can't be the case. So the second statement must be true. And in fact, there's no contradiction at all in assuming that the first statement is false and the second statement is true. That's entirely consistent. And therefore, that by, we've analyzed all the possible cases, only one of them is consistent. Therefore, that must be the case. Therefore, again, to my surprise, it turns out I must be king. That seems to me a little bit similar to Buridan's paradox. Then we come to the 11th proposition. What I am saying is false. This is the liar's paradox. This statement is false. If it's false, it's true. If it's true, it's false. And we end up again in an infinite loop. And again, and this one, I don't know whether indeed how many or whether any of these paradoxes were originally due to Buridan, but he certainly wrote them up. But this one goes back a long way, and it certainly appears in the Bible. The 12th one says that God exists and some conjunction is false. And the premise is that the only propositions there are these 3, that God exists, some conjunction is false, and their conjunction. So in that circumstance, is this true or false? Well, God exists is true. Some conjunction is false. If that is not the case, then this conjunction is false, in which case some conjunction is false. The whole thing is false if God exists and there's a false conjunction. But if this conjunction is not false, then the statement is not true, because the second conjunct is false, and therefore, so we start off by assuming the statement is true. We showed if it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. So another of these sort of paradoxes. The 13th one, there's a wall in which this proposition is written. Socrates looks at it, can't decide whether the proposition is true or false, and he knows he's in a state of doubt. So the statement is, Socrates knows the proposition written on the wall is doubtful to him. That's true because that's what we've posited. But if it's true, then Socrates knows it's true, therefore he's not doubtful about it. So that's the paradox. As an aside, since this proposition talks about things written on walls, here's an example that I found in Patrick Hughes' book, Paradoxe, of apparently graffiti from ancient Pompeii. Somebody wrote on the wall, "Everyone writes on the walls but me." And that's a nice little paradox. Somebody's had fun writing that, and it seemed to me a very modern thing to write. But this is, 2,000 years old graffiti, so people have always enjoyed these kind of paradoxes. Okay, 15th sophism. Someone is doubting a proposition. Okay, do I know if this is true or false? I don't know what anybody else is thinking. For all I know, everybody else in the world could be asleep at the moment. Perhaps the audience is, but I have no way of knowing whether or not anybody else in the world is considering a proposition at the moment and is unsure whether it is true or false. Statistically, it's probably likely, but this isn't about statistics. I certainly can't be sure that anybody in the world is doubting a proposition. So I don't know if it's true or false. In other words, I'm doubting this proposition, in which case it is true, and I know it to be true because I'm doubting it. So, but if it's true, then I'm not doubting it anymore, so I don't know it's true. And again, we get this infinite loop. And I think one of the things that Buridan is interested in is the idea of time in logical propositions. When are logical propositions true? What is the timing? Does this one, for example, alternate between true and false very quickly? Or can you make propositions about the future? So here's another, which is fairly familiar. Buridan's 16th sophism. We're going to suppose that I'm going to put a proposition to you, and you've got to respond yes if it's true, and no if it's false. So if I say to you, you're going to answer in the negative, what do you do? If you say yes, then you think the proposition is true, but it's actually turned out to be false because you said no. But if you answer no, then you're telling me the proposition is false, but in fact, you've made it true. So you've probably seen this paradox before, but it's, and again, it relates to timing. At what time are these things true? And, what's the relationship between, are propositions true for all time, or do they change as time changes? So now we come to Buridan's bridge. In this one, Plato is a rich landowner. He has a bridge, and he has an army to protect the bridge, and Socrates wants to cross. So Plato tells Socrates, if the next proposition you utter is true, then I shall allow you to cross. But if what you say is false, I'll throw you into the water. Now, at this point, Socrates could simply say 1 + 1 = 2, or God exists, or whatever Plato would accept as a true proposition, and Plato would have to let him cross. But for some strange reason, Socrates chooses to say, you're going to throw me into the water. What can Plato do now? If Plato allows Socrates to cross, then Socrates' answer must have been true, but it's false because Plato didn't throw him in the water. But if Plato does throw him into the water, then Socrates' statement is true, and Plato should have allowed him to cross. And I think Buridan's conclusion is that Plato should not have sworn an oath that he could not fulfill. And this has some currency, this paradox. It appears in Don Quixote, written 150 years later. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza discuss this paradox, and there's a version of it in Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll's version is that a crocodile had stolen a baby. The mother wanted the baby back, and the mother said, well, if you tell me what I'll do, I'll give you the baby back. If not, I will devour it. The mother cries in horror, you will devour it. And the crocodile takes this as her answer and says, no, I can't give you your baby back, because if I do, I should make you speak falsely, because you said I would devour it and I haven't. And I warned you that if you spoke falsely, I would devour it. So the crocodile says he can't return the baby, but the mother says, on the contrary, you can't eat the baby, because if you do, you made me speak the truth, and I promised that if I spoke the truth, you would restore it. And Carl suggests that this ends happily because the crocodile is a crocodile of his word, and that his sense of honor outweighed his love of eating babies. I'm not quite convinced here, actually. It seems to me that the crocodile is confounded whatever he does. If he eats the baby, then he's broken his word. But if he doesn't eat the baby, he's also broken his word. So since he's broken his word anyway, if I was the crocodile and liked eating babies, I think I would feel I should do so in this case. Anyway, that's another version, it seems to me, of the Buridan's bridge paradox. And coming to the last sophism, this one says that the circumstance is Socrates wishes Plato harm if Plato wishes Socrates harm. Whereas Plato wishes Socrates harm for some reason if Socrates does not wish Plato's harm. So who wishes harm here? Is it the case that Socrates wishes Plato harm? If so, then Plato must wish Socrates harm, but in that case, but since Socrates wishes Plato harm, Plato does not wish Socrates harm. So there's a contradiction there. If, on the other hand, Socrates doesn't wish Plato harm, then Plato wishes Socrates harm, because that's what Plato does, and therefore Socrates does wish Plato harm. So again, there's an infinite loop and no resolution. So I want to conclude by saying that, Buridan's paradoxes, I think, are interesting. They're interesting to me, possibly for different reasons from those for which he created them. He was interested in the relationship between logical structure and meaning. Can logic constrain meaning? Which is more important, the meaning of the words or the logical structure behind the propositions? And I think these remain interesting questions, but I think Buridan is a fascinating character. He must have been a remarkable person to have these strange, unlikely stories told about him. I think he deserves to be much better known. And I want to finish by giving an example which I like to think he would have enjoyed. So this is my final puzzle, and I have here, you can possibly just about see them on the shelf behind me. I've put them there so to be sure I'm not tampering with them, but there are two envelopes. One is yellow, one is red, and they contain a prize. Now, if this was a physical event, I would ask somebody to choose an envelope, and if he won the prize, I would give them a suitable prize. Since this isn't physical, I can't really do that. So what I will do is I will make a donation to the Gathering for Gardner if somebody successfully chooses the right envelope. So no pressure there. So what I would like is a volunteer to choose an envelope. I can see Pedro in the chat. So Pedro, you were the last person. So here we go. Take your time over this because a donation to Gathering for Gardner depends on it. The statement on the red envelope says at least one of the statements on these envelopes is false. And the statement on the yellow envelope says this yellow envelope contains the prize. So which envelope do you want to open to get the prize? The red one which says at least one of these statements is false, or the yellow one which says this envelope contains the prize? Pedro has chosen the red envelope. So let me fetch the red envelope and try not to drop it down the back of the sofa, which I did in practice. So this is the red envelope. and it says, at least one statement is false. Now, Pedro, I assume your analysis is this. The statement on the red envelope cannot be false, because if it's false, then it would say both statements were true, but it would be false. So if it's true, one of the statements is false, and it's not the red one, therefore it must be the yellow one. Therefore, the yellow envelope doesn't contain the prize. Therefore, the red envelope does contain the prize. And I'm now going to pull the statement out. And what we have, we can see, is no prize. The prize was not in the red envelope. The prize was, in fact, in the yellow envelope. So I'm sorry, I'll perhaps make a donation anyway because it seems a bit harsh. But the point here is that this is a joke of Raymond Smolyan's, and the point is that logic cannot constrain reality. Logic says the prize cannot be in the yellow envelope, but it was. Logic says I could not put the prize in the yellow envelope, but I did. So what's going on there? How was I able to defeat logic? Or why would one imagine that logic could stop me putting the prize in whichever envelope I chose? Anyway, I like to think John Buridan would have enjoyed this example, and I hope that you have, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Tony. That was delightful, and I have to admit you suckered me in with your puzzle, and that's an excellent point that you make about logic constraining reality. We do have a hand raised. Do you have a question, Ruth?
Yes, my question is, why is it better to choose than not choose at all?
Okay, well, if you don't choose, you starve, basically. The donkey needs to eat, but which one should it eat? So it has to make a choice. And the question is, if there's no reason to make one choice rather than the other, why would it, how can it choose which one? And this actually arises in computing. There are situations where you need to choose between deadlocks. And so one thing I think this teaches us is we need to use randomness. Randomness is important to our survival. I'm not sure that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Your final puzzle also reminds me of some of you might know of the game Gnomic that appeared in a Martin Gardner column in Scientific American, which sort of intended to represent the legislative process. It starts with a set of rules, which are sort of parliamentary, and sort of lays out the terms for a game that multiple people play. And then the basic action in this game is to propose modifications to the rules. And I decided I was going to improve on the initial setup by coming up with a set of rules that logically enforced themselves, setting up a similar sort of self-referential thing by which people logically had to follow the rules. They had no choice. And I showed this to my friends, and we sat down to play, and my friend refused to follow this rule. And I said, you can't, but he did. So yes, reality can trump logic sometimes.
Yeah. Raymond Smolyan's books are marvelous. And
so one question that springs to mind is, how familiar was Raymond Smolyan with this gentleman and his work?
Yeah.
I mean, the book of translations came out in the 1980s, so I don't know how Patrick Hughes found it. He has the same surname as the translator, but I don't have any reason to suppose they're related. No, I don't know, and it would be interesting to know. I mean, it would be interesting to know how well known Buridan is to logicians, because, as somebody with an amateur interest in this, I had never heard of these. And I find that, when I see them, I find that surprising. But that may just be my ignorance, or it may be that they aren't as well known as I think they should be.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
So Tony, that book was translated. It was translated from French, from Latin.
I assume from Latin. And I don't know, but I mean, and I should know, but I mean, I assume that he was writing in Latin because at that time, I think everybody did.
Yeah.
And presumably it's available in Latin, and I haven't actually looked for it, and I should.
So I was just wondering with regards to that puzzle at the end. I take it that's something which we're not going to find out, but it's just something to think about. Like, you're not going to like tell us what the answer is. I take it it's something to think about.
The envelope puzzle.
Yeah.
Well, the answer is it can be in whichever envelope I choose. In this case, I chose to put it in the one which you didn't expect.
Right.
I have free will. I can put it in whichever envelope I choose. This, whatever may be written on these envelopes doesn't physically constrain me.
Okay, because I did have a think about this, and I think that it can be in either envelope depending on different sort of possibilities.
Yes.
So yeah,
I think it's logically consistent both ways.
I didn't identically assert either these statements are true or false. If I said initially that both statements are either true or false, then if you believe me, then it should be in the yellow envelope, in the logical one. I mean, Raymond Smulyan in his book goes through a number of examples in which he says that these statements are either true or false, and then in this one he doesn't say it, and therefore you're free to put it in whichever one you like.
Yeah, and then there's also some possibilities which give you a contradiction. So
Okay, if there are no more questions, again, thank you, Tony. That was quite illuminating, and I'm happy to learn more about John Buridan.
Thank you.
And